Turns out that the build that we used to get to World Tier 4 at level 55, it gets even better because of the Vampiric Powers. In fact, it was so good that I just kept using it to get all the way to level 100. And to do this, we used the same setup as before, the Poison Imbuement with Twisted Blades, which is still the best in my opinion for single target damage. But we also used the Shadow Imbuement for the AoE aspect of the damage, right? And on top of that, we have some of the Vampiric Powers, like advanced Vampiric Powers that you get a little bit later on that also add a lot of AoE damage. So between those two things combined together, we have amazing AoE clearing potential to absolutely blast through levels, right? So we're obviously not fully optimized. We're a little bit of a hybrid between AoE damage and single target DPS, or like poison damage, right? So obviously it's not ideal for end game, but it worked just great. So I thought, you know, why change it? Let's just keep on going with the exact same setup. And so today I want to showcase the build real quick, show you guys how it works, and give you guys a couple of tips and tricks so that hopefully you can take advantage of this as well. All that said, let's jump right in. Let me quickly start by explaining how the build works in case this is your first time seeing it. We're using Twisted Blades with either Shadow Imbuement or Poison Imbuement for our damage. The Shadow Imbuement is also our source of AoE vulnerable in the beginning, which is why it's there, but also our AoE damage. But both of them end up doing a good amount of damage each, so the goal is simply to get the blades rotating and then tag as many mobs as you can. I like to use the dash ability to dash through the mobs while the blades are rotating to try and tag even more of them, and then I keep my Shadow Step usually for defensive purposes, but sometimes also kind of offensively if you're certain of your tactic, right? As for bosses, it's the same concept. The Poison Imbuement here is what's really doing the damage, so with the right aspects we get unlimited Poison Imbuments, which absolutely melt bosses. Anyway, now let's go check out the gear, the stats, and the Paragon points. So here's what you want on your gear while you're leveling with this build, okay? So you're definitely going to want some armor rolls on your helm and on your chest piece and on your pants, right? So at least 3 armor percentage rolls will always keep you very close or even above the cap, which is fine because you'll probably be pushing in nightmare dungeons higher than your level. If you actually want to reach the cap, you can with just armor percentage rolls. You would need another one here on your amulet, and that would bring you almost to the cap needed for tier 100 dungeons. I may do that eventually, but for the time being, I didn't because I'm not pushing that high while I was leveling. On the helm, you're also going to want Poison Imbuement and Shadow Imbuement, or maybe just Shadow Imbuement or just Poison, whichever. Some life obviously is always nice as well. On your chest piece, I would say go for like the damage reduction if you want to play it safe. I have a little bit of a mixed chest piece that has some added damage but then also some damage reduction. You will want to try and work some resistances eventually. I decided not to do that because you need to balance your resistances between a couple different pieces and your jewelry. Instead, what I did is if I felt I was a little bit low on my resistances, I would just grab one of the potions for, let's say, fire resistance, or the one that gives you plus 25% to all resistances, and then it brings everything very close to the maximum. But I didn't feel like even with these resistances, I was close to dying. I did die a couple of times, but if you really want to play it safe, then for sure try to improve these and be close to the cap. But for the time being, this worked for me, so I kind of just didn't bother, right? As for our gloves, lucky hit, crit chance, and twisting blades, obviously is real important. I don't have attack speed. I didn't roll for attack speed because I think we're getting close to the cap. We'll cover that a little bit later or in a different video, but for now I just kind of like stuck with these, and then we went with shared misery on these gloves. I forgot to mention noxious ice on the chest piece, and then we have might on the helm. As for the pants, we dropped disobedience and we're now using Umbrus instead. Disobedience is fine for the added armor, especially in the beginning, but once you get your armor percentage rolls, like I said, you're very close to your cap or even above, therefore you don't need even more armor. Even in the end game or the final build, the meta might be to not even use disobedience anymore. It's still a good aspect, but might not be needed. I was lucky enough to pull a pair of Penitent Greaves. If you don't have these, then you can always use the other one, the aspect that is for the Shadow Step, for a second charge of Shadow Step, which I absolutely love. So when I don't have the Penitent Greaves, that's what I do. And obviously I'm using Noxious Ice because I have the Penitent Greaves. So if you don't have those, then you can also replace this aspect right here. You could put Shared Misery on the chest piece, and then you could put something like Edge Master on your gloves if you wanted more damage, right? The pants, right, we covered. So armor, obviously here in damage reduction, and one of the resistances would be great instead of dodge chance, for example. As for the two-hand crossbow, all stats and dex I think is kind of a must, especially because we're going to be trying to push very high with our intelligence and strength for our Paragon points, but not as high as we previously did in Season 1, so I'll cover that in a separate video. Then we have vulnerable and poison damage, which is fine. It could be vulnerable, and core would be even maybe a little bit better, but if you're going to be starting to build for the end game build, I'll say this right now, you definitely want to pay attention for damage to crowd controlled enemies. That should be one of your priorities for the stat on your weapons and on your rings, if you can. If you don't have that right now, don't worry about it. You're still going to be doing plenty of damage. For the aspect, we have accelerating and then damage over time gems. As for our amulet, kind of like the chest piece here, a little bit of a mix between damage reduction but also some offensive stats. So we got all imbuement and malice, and then plus 15% damage. So I usually use an amulet like this for uber builds, but it's pretty good. It lacks the movement speed, unfortunately, to level even faster or to move around faster. So I would definitely suggest that you try and work movement speed on this. It could be instead of the malice or the 15% damage, but definitely try to have at least the all imbuement. Corruption is the aspect. Then we have bursting venoms on ring number 1 and blade dancer on the other one. For the stats on these, we're looking for crit chance, lucky hit. Resource generation is also really good. And then damage to crowd controlled enemies or damage to close enemies. Poison damage is all stuff that is going to work. Poison damage will obviously only work with your poison imbuement, so not as good for the shadow imbuement. So try and get something that's a little bit more universal if you can. For our daggers, we did not get a Sheriff's Conjar yet. We're using Condemnation because it's still a pretty good dagger, which will help for the like critical damage with the shadow imbuement, for example. And obviously we're using combo points, and so basically it's a great dagger until we get a Sheriff's Conjar. And then for the other dagger, same concept here. We're going for like dex and all stats if we could. Damage to crowd controlled enemies. Damage over time will work with the poison, but not the shadow. Damage to stun is a little bit universal, so that's great. But the aspect that you want is pestilent points, right? So pestilent points and bursting venoms is kind of like your must for single target DPS. So definitely try and have at least those when you're going to start fighting the Nightmare Dungeon bosses of higher tier. I did have this other dagger that I used before. I kind of just got this one, so to be fully transparent here, this is the one that I used to get all the way to level 100. All right, then we have the skills. Again, not much has changed. It's the good old Twisted Blades build. So Puncture, Twisted Blades, a couple of points in those passives right there. Then we have our Shadow Step with our passives. Dash, 2 points in here. Now we do have 3 points into our Dark Shroud because we started using the Umbrous aspect, and this gives us a nice 8% crit chance. They actually modified this so that you need less of the Dark Shrouds up to get the bonus. That's even better. It also provides us with some damage reduction, which is fantastic, and it activates even though you don't have the skill on your bar, which is even better. And then Malice here and Exploit. And then we have a couple of points into Shadow Imbuement, Enhance, and the Mixed Shadow Imbuement. This is the part that I was saying where later on you can switch to this once you have the right Vampiric Powers to spread your vulnerable, but before that I was using this one, right, for most of the leveling. Then we have our Poison Imbuement with those passives, +3 into Deadly Venom. I did have a couple of points into this one for a while. I think I took the 3 points and I moved it to this recently, but this will help with your survivability, so you can do that in the beginning. Frigid Finesse you only really need if you end up getting the Penitent Greaves. If you don't have those, then use those 3 points elsewhere, for example right there. Then 3 into Innervation and Second Wind for our energy regeneration. We still have adrenaline rush, 3 points into haste, and we still are using momentum for the extra damage reduction, movement speed, energy regeneration. It's all great, but eventually, obviously, we're going to be switching to this one here for maximum DPS, but we're not quite there yet. Then we have the Paragon points, which are a work in progress. So I'm just going to go over the glyphs, I think, real quick, because it's the same sort of boards as before. I'm probably going to switch it around pretty soon, but the glyphs are pretty consistent, right? Versatility is kind of always in there. Control is kind of always in there. This one's actually missing a point. I need to fix that. Oh, this one too. Canny. It's not fully leveled though, so that's the issue with that one. Then we have Devious for the extra stats or on the magic nodes. I love that one too, kind of like versatility. We have Closer. Then we have the Bane, obviously, for the poison damage, and the efficacy on the No Witness board, which I also love this setup right there. So that's kind of the gist of it, but I will have a builder at some point with all the correct Paragon points. And finally, the Vampiric Powers. Now, the ones I'm using right now are not the ones that I used leveling up, okay? So I do want to make that clear. So I'll go over the ones that I did use and the ones, obviously, they're not useful and why, right? So I'm currently using the Domination. This one is for added damage to stun, immobilized, or frozen, or feared mobs, which we do. So we do a little bit of freezing and some stun. If you have shared misery, you're also spreading that. So that's great. Then we have the Prey on the Weak, more damage to vulnerable enemies, and enemies are vulnerable while affected by a vampiric curse. This is really important. This is how we're spreading our vulnerable later on, this combined with another one. Then we have the Ravenous, which is fantastic because we're getting a huge attack speed boost, and because of this, I believe that we're getting close to our cap. If I understand correctly, it's 100%, except for the accelerating aspect, which means we don't need as much increased attack speed on our gear. So I believe that between this and Shur's Conjar, we're already pretty close, and then you add to that the other passive close quarters combat that we want to use later on. Anyway, then we have a Cursed Touch. So this is the one that you get later on, and that will help you spread your vulnerable. So these two combined together work nicely, not to mention that you get some added damage from the stored souls. You're going to have a little stacks here that are going to build up at the bottom, and then when you use a certain type of skill, it's basically going to release those souls, and they do a lot of damage. In fact, it can also take the shield down on the Butcher very fast, which is a very convenient for you to then get your poison damage to deal all that damage. And finally, we are using Flowing Veins for obvious reasons, because we're basically getting more increased damage over time, especially if they're affected by a vampiric curse, which we get with this one. Okay, so this is kind of the setup that I'm doing right now. It is a total of, that seems to be about what, like 18 points. I believe the maximum is 20, right? So just be mindful of that when you're going to build it. As for the other ones that I used, I use this one, Undying, in the beginning. You don't really have a choice. You get kind of like the white ones first. So I ran that for a while. And then I believe I used this one here. Not all that much, but I might use this one when pushing higher Nightmare tier dungeons. Resilience. So definitely leveled that one up as well. Then we have Hectic, which I kind of want to play around with a little bit. It might be interesting to see what kind of cooldowns we can get. This one, Hemanancy, obviously used a lot in the beginning, fantastic, but eventually I feel like it kind of became obsolete, but the heal from this is fantastic. It also helps to kill some of the lower level mobs or the mobs with that don't have a lot of HP, so definitely useful in the beginning, but I think that in the end game for this build doesn't really have its place. Then these we're not really going to use. Nope. Maybe a barrier would be interesting to work with, because we do have some aspects that will give us more damage if we have a barrier. So we'll see. Maybe we'll play around with this one eventually. Metamorphosis, interesting, but I'm not sure I need this for the PvE aspect. Moonrise, more attack speed, could be interesting, but again, we're close to the cap, so maybe we would have to like drop Ravenous, so we'll see. Call Familiar, no. Bathe in Blood, no. Cursed Touch, it's there. Blood Boil, and then that's it, right? So that's kind of the gist of the powers that I used so far. These are the ones that I'm currently using. That's the overall build. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.